Dr. William Burnett, and I'm a forensic psychiatrist, mainly a forensic child psychiatrist. And I've been working in the area of parental alienation for about 40. Well, I've done some research. I've done some basic research, but also I've written practice guidelines for how to do a custody evaluation. So some of that pertains to alienation. And I've been particularly interested in misinformation about parental alienation. So I've tried to discuss that and to some extent clarify it and refute it. Well, in the beginning, of course, we did not have a name for alienation. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was observed. I used to do child custody evaluations, so I saw a few cases where alienation was happening, but we didn't have a name for it. So it was only when alienation was named by Richard Gardner in 1985, people became more aware of it. So in the 90s, Dr. Gardner and I were both involved in writing a practice guideline for how to do a child custody evaluation. So parental alienation was mentioned in that practice guideline. This is published by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And so I think that was the first time that parental alienation was ever mentioned in a document that was part of an organization, an official document of an organization. So that was published in the 1990s. So I guess what happened as alienation became better known, it also became criticized. And people who were concerned wrote criticisms and kind of different ways to diminish the concept of alienation because they were concerned that parental alienation was being misused in court. So that was maybe in the early 2000s. And then since then, everything has expanded on both sides of that debate. In other words, there have been more and more articles about parental alienation and more research and more books and publications, but there has also been more criticism that both the proponents of alienation and the critics of alienation have both become much more active, I suppose, in the last 15 years. So, of course, that has made it, in a way, more difficult, but also more important to get the word out. Well, I think it's a big problem because it misinforms therapists and evaluators, whether psychologists or social workers or psychiatrists. They become misinformed about the reality of parental alienation. And so they might not recognize it. If it happens right in front of them, they might not realize that it's happening. Or if it is happening, they might misinterpret it. And of course, I think the severe critics take an extreme stance. I mean, some of them say that parental alienation doesn't even happen, that it doesn't exist, or they use the word hoax. Sometimes they say that parental alienation was a hoax invented by Richard Gardner and promoted by other people. But that's an extreme position. Most critics agree that the basic phenomenon happens, that children do become indoctrinated by one parent to avoid the second parent, the other parent. So almost everybody, even among the critics, agree that the basic phenomenon happens, but they're concerned about it because they think sometimes it's misused in court. So that's basically where we are now. And that some specific aspects of parental alienation theory are criticized. For instance, reintegration or reunification programs are criticized because some people feel that they're not all that helpful, or that children even might be damaged in some way by a reunification program. Well, I think that happens a lot in science, that a person with a particular idea, some people don't like it and they get criticized. So that certainly happened to Gardner. I think the problem with Gardner's criticism is that some of it was just ridiculous, and that some people said that Richard Gardner was a proponent of pedophilia, for instance. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so I think some of it was totally unfair. Some of it was misinformed. They said, well, Gardner never published anything in a peer-reviewed journal. Well, that's not correct, because he did that many times. Or they say, oh, he wasn't really a professor at Columbia University, but he really was. So a lot of the criticism of Gardner was simply wrong. The criticism itself was misinformed. So that was sad, and I think it was hard for him to deal with that. But, he did fight back. He wrote articles himself in which he clarified these statements that people made about him. So he tried to get the honest information out to the public. Well, we tried to get the words parental alienation into both the DSM and the ICD, and I would say we were half successful in that we never did get the actual words in, but we did get an understanding that there are other diagnoses that can be used. And we've been told this by the leadership of the DSM-5 revision committee have told us that if we have a case of parental alienation, we can use their diagnosis, which is parent-child relational problem, which is an official legitimate diagnosis. And there's another diagnosis called child affected by parental relationship distress, or there's another one of child psychological abuse. So all these can be used if we have a case, and if we need to put a diagnosis down, for instance, on a report, we can put down parent-child relational problem, and that's an accepted DSM diagnosis. The use of a particular diagnosis depends on the nature of the evaluation that a person is doing. For instance, if the evaluation is focusing on the alienating parent, there is a diagnosis which is child psychological abuse, which is the diagnosis is applied to the person who's engaging in the abusive behavior. So that's child psychological abuse. If the focus of the evaluation is mainly on the psychological situation of the child, then it might make sense to use the diagnosis child affected by parental relationship distress. That's a very long term, but that's the term in the DSM, child affected by parental relationship distress. And you can see how that would apply to a child who is caught between two parents and becomes alienated from one of them. So that's if the focus is on the child. If the evaluation happens to be focused on the relationship between the child and the rejected parent, then it would make sense to use parent-child relational problem. And in fact, even the definition of that, the actual DSM definition, includes a phrase that describes parental alienation. It doesn't have the word alienation in it, but it does describe what happens in a parental alienation situation. So there are several terms, and the right one really depends on the nature of the evaluation. Well, first of all, definition of severe. We use severe to mean situations in which the alienated child has not seen or has refused to see the rejected parent for a very long time, for instance, months or years, or if the alienated child does spend time with the rejected parent, they're negative during the entire visit. They don't interact, they don't have dinner, they stay in their room, they might stay on their cell phone with the preferred parent. So that's our definition. And usually in severe cases, the child is totally resistant to changing because the child has totally adopted this negative view. And not only that, the alienating parent is totally resistant to changing because he or she is convinced that they're doing the right thing. So in cases like this, traditional kind of interventions or therapy or family therapy just don't work because the child and the alienating parent are totally uninterested. I mean, they simply refuse to participate in family therapy in severe cases of alienation. So we take that to be severe psychological abuse, that a child who is in that situation is a victim of severe psychological abuse, and we say the child has to be removed from that household. It's just like any other thing. If there's physical abuse or sexual abuse, you have to remove the child from the parent or the person who's engaging in abusive behaviors. So that's what we would say, that in severe cases, especially when other forms of therapy have been tried and have failed, which is almost always the case, then the child needs to be removed from that household, and the child needs to be helped to reunite and reunification with the rejected parent. I mean, so we say that's pretty straightforward. In severe cases, that's the only thing that might work. I've had cases where that happens. Sometimes the child is transferred to the previously rejected parent, and sometimes they go to one of these programs, these 4 or 5 day programs. For instance, Family Bridges is one, or Family Reflections was one that used to occur in Canada, or maybe it still does, Family Reflections in Canada. And there are some other programs. And so sometimes when the child is moved to the previously rejected parent, they go to a program and it's helpful. And they come back and they go on with their lives in this new household. I've had a few cases where they don't even go to the program, that it's just transferring custody, and the rejected parent takes care, to be respectful of the child, and the child settles into the home because the court has ordered them to move from one home to the other. So they do that, and they move on with their lives. And their attempts are made to help the child still have contact with the previously alienating parent. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But yes, I've had cases, and I know of cases, where the child gets transferred and there's no, they have some coaching or some counseling in the new household, but that's what it takes to get them to move on. Well, the general rule is that alienators are convinced that they're in the right, that they're not just doing this for fun. I mean, they really think that the child might be hurt by the parent who is now rejected. And there are different reasons why they might think that. But typically, people who have set opinions that are mistaken, usually they have some kind of personality disorder. For instance, a person who's narcissistic just insists that his or her worldview is the correct worldview and everybody else is wrong. So if they develop the opinion that they're the best parent, usually narcissistic people are very kind of self-congratulatory. So if they're the best parent for this child, they know that and they're convinced of that. And so they feel they're justified in keeping the child from the other parent. Or there are other personality disorders. For instance, their borderline personality disorder is a situation where the parent is extremely sensitive to rejection. And so if they feel somebody's rejecting them, for instance, if they get divorced and they feel their previous spouse is now rejecting them, they just feel that extremely strongly. And so they then reject that person back. And that takes the form of getting the child to reject the other parent. So I think there are different personality styles that feed into becoming an alienating parent. I don't know that it has. I mean, I think these cases are about the same as they've always been. I think they're more common because I think they're recognized more. And I think if one parent sees it happening, I think they're more likely now to figure out what's happening and to fight back. So I think it may be 30 years ago that if a parent simply took the child and went on their own way, that maybe the rejected parent simply let it happen. Now there's more of a feeling of equal rights, and parents have equal rights in terms of being a parent, and maybe they're more likely to fight back if they see that happening. Well, I hope that the research continues. We see some really good research these days, and I hope that continues into even more creative ways of studying these families. So that's one hope. I think we certainly need to educate mental health people and law people, both attorneys and judges, so that they recognize it earlier rather than later, because earlier it's easier to treat. So I hope that judges tune in and recognize if some mild form of alienation is happening, that the judges intervene and say, don't do that, cut this out. Both of you cooperate with your child having a relationship with both of you. So those are the main things that I hope happen. Legislation probably needs to be adjusted, because legislation needs to support the idea that alienation is a bad thing. And it needs to help both the court people and the family people identify alienation and do something about it. I haven't had hardcore deniers do that, but I think I have, I guess you might call soft critics. Sometimes you can have a conversation with, and they can say, oh yeah, they can see that, yes, alienation really does happen some of the time, and yes, it should be recognized. I kind of distinguish between soft critics who seem to be willing to negotiate somewhat, and hard critics who absolutely take a position and they don't want to discuss it. No, I've never experienced it in any respect, or nobody in my family, my extended family, I don't think, has ever had any experience like this. But as a child psychiatrist, I mean, I was doing child custody evaluations. That was part of what I did. And so as part of those evaluations, I came across cases of alienation. And then I was active in this child psychiatry organization, and that's where I met Richard Gardner. And so I just became more aware of it, and I thought something should be done about it. I think he'd be delighted. I think that in his time, it was too soon, perhaps, to try to get it off the ground. But I think he'd be very happy to see it. Well, there are a lot of advocacy organizations in this field, and they're very, very helpful, especially to targeted parents and grandparents. So I hope that they become better known, and then that parents find them. There are so many of them. I think that's what I hope happens. I hope that what I would like parents to do is to do their homework. If they find themselves in this situation, to read up on it and to participate in some kind of advocacy activity. And secondly, they need to create their own support group. Everybody needs a support group, and an alienated parent can find these pre-existing support groups, but they need to create their own with their own family members, their therapy people, maybe their attorney, maybe their clergyman, that they can really instantly rely on if something difficult happens. So that's what I suggest for targeted parents. Well, I don't think it'll be eradicated, because the thing that drives it are people with severe personality disorders. Severe personality disorders have been around for thousands of years, so they're not going to go away. And people with these severe disorders, it influences how they see their children. They take possession of their children and want to use them for their own purposes. And so I don't think that's going to go away. I think what might happen is we can train mental health and legal people to identify it when it does happen. I hope we're able to do that. Well, I think they have a role to educate themselves. Judges do. You know, the legal system is set up as best it can to solve difficult situations where people can't agree. I mean, if everybody agreed, if divorcing parents could agree, they wouldn't need to go to court. But the legal system is very complicated, and involves evidence, and everybody gets a say. If somebody makes an allegation, somebody else gets to respond. It would be great if it could function more quickly, that if there were cases where alienation seemed to be happening, that it could be addressed more quickly. And, you know, that was the topic of some of the presentations here this week, of how to fast track cases involving high conflict divorce. So that would be great. And, you know, and there are ideas that maybe the family court system should be less adversarial. For instance, maybe parents should be required to engage in some sort of negotiation, or what's the right word for that, form of obligatory mediation. So some states, I think, try to do that. So maybe that heading in that direction might be helpful. Well, we just published this new book, not me personally, but PASG just published this new book called Parental Alienation Theory, Official Synopsis, and that we hope that will be influential in educating judges and attorneys and legislators and other people who are influential, because the whole idea of the book is it's not very big. It's only 140 pages, so it can be read by a judge in a couple of hours. And it's also, we consider it the official dogma or document of PASG, Parental Alienation Study Group. And so we want it to be accepted, like the definitions and the terminology and so on. And we also want to have critics comment on it. We want critics to write in and say, hey, why don't we say this instead of that? And we'll try to take that into consideration. So I think that was a really big accomplishment for this year. Came out a couple of months ago. So that's what I like going on. That's what I like right now.